Alright guys, today we'll be reacting to The Fallen of World War II. Now I have seen this video numerous times. It's been a couple years, I think, last time I've watched it, but I do remember quite a bit. I think it's an excellent video. See if it still holds up to last time I viewed it. Let's look at it from a purely historical or historian's perspective instead of just like fan content, so to speak, I guess.
The average lifespan of an American is 80 years, and an 80-year-old today was 10 when World War II ended, 4 when it began. A soldier who saw battle would have to be in his late 80s at least today. Generals, political leaders, the decision-makers of the war, few are still with us. And over the past few decades, we've seen authors and filmmakers rush to capture stories from survivors before this connection of memory is lost. This project is not about individual war stories, and it's not about survivors. We're going to tally up the tens of millions of people who...
That is talent right there. That is attention to individual line, I'm guessing, is individual, so obviously to accurately that does it really see all the different lines. I think the screen would just be white.
Whose lives are cut short by the war. And see how these numbers stack up to other wars in history, including trends in recent conflicts.
Love the animation.
Counting soldiers and civilians separately.
As should be.
Each of these figures represents 1,000 people who died. Civilians were of all walks of life, whereas military deaths were almost entirely men. The average age was about 23.
Young war.
In most battles, for every 1,000 soldiers killed, there are more than 1,000 who were injured. The word casualty can be confusing because in military speak, it often includes both deaths and injuries.
Yes.
And anything else that takes a soldier out of service. Here, we're just counting the deaths.
Okay.
And we'll begin with American soldiers.
God, the animation is top notch. This video is already a few years old.
Over 400,000 died. Most of the deaths occurred in the European theater, fighting the Nazis. And about a quarter were in the Pacific, fighting the Japanese. When you put them on the timeline, you see that casualties were the heaviest at the end of the war. The war began on September 1st, 1939. But the U.S. wasn't willing to join the fight until Pearl Harbor.
September 1st, 1939, for those that don't know, even though I'm going to assume most people that are watching my videos probably already know this kind of stuff, especially World War II. But for those, just in case there are any that don't know, September 1st, 1939 is the day that Germany invades Poland.
2 years in. The deaths increased drastically on D-Day, when the Allies invaded Normandy. One of the most tragic moments of the war was on D-Day at Omaha Beach, where 2,500 Americans fell.
And if you were part of that first wave, you were
So about
most
the
likely
same number of U.S. soldiers died on this single beach landing as the entire 13 years of the recent war in Afghanistan. The bloodiest battle in the Pacific was Okinawa, which lasted 82 days, during which 12,500 Americans died. About 5,000 of these deaths were at sea from kamikaze attacks. Now let's look at some other countries, starting with Europe.
into the
Germany
Reich.
started World War II when it invaded Poland. Poland ultimately lost 200,000 soldiers in the war. Most died after the invasion while the country was occupied by Germany and the Soviet Union. Germany, meanwhile, lost just 16,000 in the invasion of Poland. The Nazis went on to invade and conquer other countries, including Denmark, Belgium, the Netherlands, France, Greece, and Yugoslavia. France surrendered, but after losing 92,000 soldiers in the Battle of France. Over 200,000 ultimately fell, which includes deaths in POW camps, French colonies, and other fighting. Yugoslavia suffered almost 500,000 military deaths. The initial invasion brought relatively few casualties on both sides, but the deaths mounted under Nazi occupation due to guerrilla fighting, civil conflict, and mass executions.
There was a lot of. I feel like that's one thing. I feel like there's not much talk about, at least for me, in American school. You learn about the French resistance and maybe a little bit about Danish resistance. Little sprinkles here and there of Polish resistance. You never hear anything about Yugoslavian resistance. Or, you know, Croatians. Bosnians, Macedonia, all the countries that make Serbia, all the countries that make up what was the Yugoslavia. Never hear about it.
The Nazi invasions were swift, with relatively few German losses. Even the Nazi commanders expressed surprise at their success.
Truth, yeah.
And then we have the United Kingdom and the United States, who were not invaded but took the fight to the Nazis. Britain lost about the same number of soldiers as the US, which includes the British colonies.
So is this counting? I'm sure this will be explained later, but just in case it's not, does that mean that number is including Indian, or is it just including Canadian? Or when they say colonies, they mean the small colonies that were essentially just like, you know, Falklands, those kind of the small individualized colonies of the United Kingdom that weren't big enough to be their own nation, so to speak.
Germany lost about 500,000 soldiers fighting the US and Britain in what is known as the Western Front, which took place in France and Belgium.
Only 500,000? Oh, here we go.
But most Nazi soldiers died on the Eastern Front, Germany's unsuccessful invasion of the Soviet Union. The numbers are staggering. The most famous battle of the Eastern Front, and perhaps the turning point of the European war, was Stalingrad. The German Sixth Army successfully took Stalingrad, but then got surrounded by the Soviets and cut off from food and ammunition.
Fighting
500,000 Nazis would ultimately die in Stalingrad. Another 100,000 were taken prisoner, of which 6,000 would ever return. POWs had a low survival rate throughout World War II, and it was particularly grim in the East.
A little correction a bit. The low survival rate for POWs was particularly the Germans towards Slavic peoples. The Germans towards, say, the Nordic, the Norwegians and Danes, and then towards the Dutch, Belgian, and French, and the British and Americans, they typically treated the Westerners quite well. But to the Russians, Poles, Yugoslavians, the Slavs in general, they were treated harshly and most likely were killed. Your chances of death if you were a Russian prisoner, if you were a Russian taken prisoner by the Germans, you would probably die. And the same because of the treatment the Germans put on the Russians, when they started winning, the Russians then started to treat the Germans in kind of the same way, with the same kind of levels of brutality. And also because, you know, the Germans invaded their homeland and they were angry at the loss of life of their comrades, of their family members, of their fellow countrymen. So when they captured Germans, the revenge, so to speak, could also, in some cases, probably be a lot worse than how the Germans treated Soviet prisoners. But the Germans, especially the SS, were quite cruel to the Soviets. So I'm not like trying to justify anyone's actions. I'm not trying to demean what happened to certain peoples. I'm just trying to put perspective into the Soviet response. to also explain why POWs were treated poorly.
When you include these POWs, roughly the same number of Germans died in Stalingrad as all the Western Front fighting against France, the UK, and the US.
God, that one just blows my mind. One battle cost the same amount of lives as all of the Western Front.
And though Stalingrad was a victory for the Soviets, they suffered almost twice as many losses as Germany.
Yeah.
The Soviet Union would eventually defeat the once unstoppable German army, killing 2.3 million Nazi soldiers. But winning the war came at a cost.
Music is just perfect, too. I wonder if he composed the music himself or something. And on. Soviets suffered the most in terms of. They didn't suffer the most in terms of
8.7 million,
in terms of
the
percentage,
official tally by the Russian military.
but
Hotly
in
disputed
your
number.
number.
Some studies have calculated as many as 14 million dead.
That's the thing. It's one of those things that's kind of interesting to me. If they were to do this video for World War One, there's a lot more guesswork in the amount that died for World War One than there is for World War Two. World War Two, we have better censuses, better, population numbers, and then we're able to better estimate the loss of life that happened because of the better just reporting and statistics that happened in World War Two compared to World War One. It'd be interesting to see if they've the fallen of World War One. But
To complete the
yeah, that's something that it's like they've either lost 8.4 million. That's the conservative number. Some people estimate it's up to 14 million just for loss of soldiers. Like, that's just crazy.
count of European military deaths, we need to add German deaths from other fronts, including the North and Africa, as well as deaths from other Axis powers allied with the Nazis: Hungary, Romania, and Italy. When you put these European military deaths on the timeline, it looks like this. You can now interact with the chart to learn more. Pause the narration if you would like more time.
The amount of work that went into this is amazing.
And now we switch to civilian deaths in Europe.
Well, this is gonna.
6 million Jewish people were killed in the Holocaust. If you separate this by country, you see that about half, 2.7 million, were Polish. 700,000 were Soviets, followed by Hungary and 17 other countries. Broken down another way, about half of the 6 million were killed in the concentration camps.
I think this is very interesting to see, because early on in the war, this mobile squads, they had troops that like moved behind the main armies. They were just death squads. So if Jews were captured, executed there. But I think they switched to these ghettos and to these camps because, for one, they wanted to use the slave labor of Jews and of try and keep up with production in a sense, aside from their horrific studies by their doctors and their racist viewpoints. And ultimately, in the end, kill them. But the mobile squads, I think they switched from the mobile squads to the camps is because they were just killing them right then and there. I was putting a, it was messing with even the soul. Like, you think these people super messed up? These people that are doing these mobile squads, because I think they were mostly SS as well. And even them, these horrible people. Because, to be honest, people that are in the SS are volunteers. They are handpicked. They are the ones. They are the ones that truly believe in the Nazi regime. They are bad. My understanding of what the SS was, they were handpicked. They truly believed in what Hitler was wanting for the world. They were the ones that mainly made up the mobile squad. I think even them, they were suffering mental problems because they were just mass slaughtering people. Just messed up.
Over 1 million died in Auschwitz. Most were killed in the gas chambers. Others died from starvation, exhaustion, disease, and other forms of execution. The second most deadly camp was Treblinka, which was exclusively an extermination camp, set up to look like a train station.
Yes.
Mobile killing groups killed 1.4 million Jews.
Okay, he's going into it.
Like with the gas chambers, men were killed first to reduce the risk of revolt.
Yep.
The Holocaust also includes non-Jewish deaths. Between 130,000 to 500,000 Roma, then called
Beautiful. Beautiful. He's going into it.
gypsies, were killed. The numbers are disputed. About 250,000 people with disabilities were killed. Homosexuals, Catholics, and other groups were also exterminated, but their numbers were relatively small. Some historians say that other civilian deaths should go under the label of Holocaust. About 2 million non-Jewish Poles were killed under German occupation, some of which were sent to the gas chambers at Auschwitz. When you combine civilian and military deaths, over 16% of the total Polish population died in World War II.
I'm just to state, I think I am personally part of that group that believe civilian casualties, especially the civilian casualties of the Slavic people of Poland, Russia, etc. I do believe that those numbers should be included talking about the Holocaust, because the Holocaust was not solely about the execution of the Jews. That was somewhat the main focus of it, but it was also another main focus of it was kill the Slavic peoples. That was one of the things Hitler advocated for. He didn't just want the Jews gone, he wanted the Slavic people gone. He was hyper racist Slavic people. Yeah, I do believe that number that civilian loss for Poland, Russia, be counted in Holocaust numbers.
Which is the highest percentage of any country. But not the highest in total death count. The Soviet Union again tops that list, losing at least as many civilians as it did soldiers, somewhere between 10 and 20 million.
Yeah.
A particularly dark moment for the Soviet Union was the siege of Leningrad,
Oh,
now
yeah.
St. Petersburg. German forces surrounded Leningrad before civilians could be evacuated. Supplies, including food, were cut off for 2.5 years.
You see, I don't know if this is stupid of me, but I would love I know there's probably Russian movies made of it, and they're probably high quality. But like, I want a dark, serious, as realistic as you can probably get it without getting the movie banned. I want a Leningrad and Stalingrad movie.
1.5 million people died as a result, mostly from starvation.
You know what I would love? Somewhat like do it kind of like in the 1917 kind of film way. You make it appear as if it's a one-shot film. So you see the soldier just getting wearier and wearier as the days go by, as the fighting continues, and hand-to-hand combat that was absolutely brutal in the sieges of Leningrad and Stalingrad.
Mostly civilians.
I don't know why.
Stalin's cruelty towards his own people is partly responsible for these numbers.
Yes.
He often didn't allow civilians to evacuate from cities, thinking it would cause the soldiers protecting them to fight harder. About 1 million Soviets died in Stalin's own labor camps, called the Gulag.
Yep.
Just about every country suffered civilian losses, especially countries who were invaded. While many died as a result of so-called collateral damage, the biggest numbers occurred when it was no accident. Civilians were exterminated, purposely fired upon or bombed, used as human shields, or intentionally deprived of food.
That's specifically what he's specifically talking about would happen with Germany towards any of the Slavic peoples, so Poland, Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, etc., those kind of nations. But then it also occurred with the Soviet Union towards Germany. There's the rape of Berlin that happened. It is kind of, I think, somewhat similar to, not as nowhere near as severe, but is kind of seen as in the similar light to the rape of Nanjing by the Japanese towards the Chinese. Obviously, the rape of Nanjing far worse than what happened in Berlin, but what happened in Berlin was several 100,000 women were by Soviet forces that were moving into.
Intentional killing of civilians was done by most warring parties, including the United Kingdom and the United States. The United Kingdom was spared of a land invasion, but still lost 60,000 civilians, largely from German air raids or blitzes, often directed at civilian population centers. The UK did the same to German cities at a much greater magnitude, causing about 10 times the number of deaths. But most German civilian deaths came from the ground at the late stage of the war. When the Nazi regime collapsed, civilians living in occupied regions had to desperately flee from the advancing Soviet army. Rapes were widespread, and death estimates ranged from 600,000 to 3 million.
I think I personally would put it at I think I'd meet in the middle, in my opinion. I think I'd meet in the middle to high end. I think I'd go around 2 million. Around 2 million probably seems about right for me, because just historically what you see in these mass expulsion movements, or when an invading army comes into another country and this stuff typically happens, these numbers are very high, very astronomical. So I think that higher end towards that 2 million is probably, my head, probably more realistic, just because of the scale of world, just how many died and so.
Let's step back and see where we are with the totals.
God.
We just counted about 20 million civilian deaths in Europe. If you add this to the European military deaths we already covered, it brings us to over 40 million. Then we have the Asian theater. Here we see the vast majority of military deaths in Asia came from China and Japan. On the civilian side, about 6 million deaths from China, Indonesia, Korea, Indochina, and the Philippines.
Okay, so they are putting India separate to British casualties. So that means, yes, I think when they talked about colonies, I think maybe they were talking about Canada, Australia, the British white colonies, the white settler colonies. Those would be South Africa, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand.
Can be attributed to Japanese war crimes, which are sometimes compared to the Nazi atrocities due to the sheer scale of the cruelty.
Yeah.
China had the second highest death count after the Soviet Union. And like the Soviets, the Chinese government demonstrated a stunning willingness to sacrifice its own people. Chinese nationalists opened the dike at the Yellow River, hoping the flood would halt the Japanese advance.
What's also interesting about this, and what it would end up doing after the war, this Yellow River flood would open up a scenario pretty much for Mao Zedong to challenge the Chinese party the Chinese Nationalist Party, and the Kuomintang, I believe they're called. Kuomintang? I can't pronounce it right, probably. But Mao Zedong and a bunch of the Chinese civilians would look at this river flood and blame the government, and they would flip to the communist side because it's like, yo, at least Mao Zedong didn't flood us when we were fighting for our lives against foreign invaders, the Japanese. So this flood would not only cost a bunch of lives and not even work right to stop the Japanese or even really slow them down all too much. It would cause the fall of China and the rise of communist China.
500,000 Chinese civilians or more were killed, which is 2 or 3 times the number who died in all countries in the 2004 Asian tsunamis.
I love how they're comparing it to scenarios that
But the
we've
invasion of China,
that he's comparing it to scenarios that have happened in our lifetime that most people watching this video nowadays would have been alive for. Since this video is getting taught in classes, some of those kids were born in 2004 or even later now. For instance, when I started being a TA, my first time being a TA would have been my last year high school. That would have been 4-ish years ago or something like that now. And when I was there, kids I were TAing were freshmen. They were there in their first year. Those kids were not born before 9/11. And so that to me seemed wild. And yeah, I was a kid when 9/11 happened. I was like 3-4 years old, but I was still alive. I don't know, it's just wild to me. And then even with the 2004 tsunami, I was 7-8 years old when that happened. So I remember seeing it like on TV on American news. So I think comparing this loss of life to what we've seen today, what we've seen and viewed as astronomical loss of life, and then looking at it and comparing it to the loss of life in World War II is just mind-boggling. It really sets the tone, and the just sheer size of World War II.
China only cost Japan 200,000 soldiers. Most were killed fighting the US and Allies in the Pacific War. A significant portion of Japanese civilian deaths were caused by American firebombing and the 2 nuclear attacks.
Yes, I think though that the firebomb strikes, I think this number might be a little off based just looking off of the amount here and the amount here, but maybe he's counting like deaths that occurred after the initial nuke. So cancer deaths. I believe the firebomb strikes ultimately killed more people than both nukes. I don't know how much more, but I know it was more.
Contrary to official US statements, these airstrikes were directed at civilian populations.
Yes. Perfect. Yes. Nuclear bombs also were not targeted towards military facilities. They were targeted towards population centers. They were targeted towards Nagasaki and Hiroshima because of the civilians living there. They wanted to send a message and to also show that they are willing to do what's necessary to end this war. They are willing, because here's the thing, one of the things that I think is a common viewpoint that many people have of the US government, and it's usually wrong, is that the US government does not want to cost civilian lives. That's wrong. The US government is not willing to really sacrifice their own civilian lives, but they will strike foreign and enemy combatant civilian centers to win, as shown with the nuclear strikes and the firebombings of Tokyo. They are willing to do it. But do not believe when the US says that they were targeting military centers. No. especially in World War II, they were targeting civilian centers because that is one way to end a war fast, is by targeting civilian centers to ruin the morale of the population. Ruin the morale of the population is more likely to rebel against the government and thus end the war. That is what was seen in World War I when the people were starving again in Germany and they rebelled against their government and got rid of the Kaiser and then sued for peace.
Not military targets. When you add all the deaths outside Europe, it brings us to a grand total of 70 million for the war.
God. Oh. You take that number, you try and picture that today. You try and compare that to the nations around. If that were to happen in the U.S. Now, if this were to happen to the U.S. in World War II, 70 million, the United States had a population of roughly 120 million or so in the States during the Second World War. If they lost 70 million, they would be reduced to 50 million in the States. That's how I try and picture it. And I think I've done the math before. I think if this percentage of loss of life was brought to the modern day, this loss of life was roughly 3% of the world's population at the time of the war. Put that in today's numbers, that is roughly, I believe, in the 400 million to 600 million range. That is insane.
Give or take, depending on who's counting and what civilian deaths get included. More people died in World War II than in any other war in history.
Yep.
For comparison, here are 20 or so of the very worst wars and atrocities.
I love this as well. So if we look, okay, so they say 15 million. He estimates 15 million. But look at that. The deaths that Mao Zedong would cause happened 10 years after World War II. They happened roughly in the 50s to 60s, I believe. The large proportion of them, because this was famine. This was the famine that happened. Stalin's deaths, they kind of overlap. Pre-World War II, and then also into the post-World War II, and also inside of World War II. So that 20 million, I think a few million of that is probably in the 70 million. Let's look at this.
Have on record. Some of these are more of atrocities than wars, but we've seen how that distinction can get blurry.
Yes.
Some of these spanned across centuries. World War II had the highest body count, and it all happened in just 6 years.
The Mongol conquest, on the other hand, happened in the span of a couple decades.
The world's population has grown significantly since the earliest atrocities on this list. If you want to compare them in terms of what percentage of the world died,
Oh my
you
God.
can adjust the chart to look like this. This rough approximation tells us there may have been more devastating wars before World War II, proportionally speaking.
See, I love that. I like looking at things in proportions because I feel like it better helps you understand things. If you put the loss of life into the modern proportions, I think that better helps for people to understand, because there are just so many people living today. But even when you say 20 million died, there's 7 billion people. You say 20 million people died, and you do the math to put it today, and that equals, like, I don't know, 100 million. Suddenly, it clicks in people's heads. At least it does for me. I don't know if anyone else is like that.
When we turn to post-war conflicts, it's hard to say anything that isn't controversial. But the data shows something quite extraordinary has been happening. In 1989, John Gaddis coined the phrase "the long peace" to identify the absence of conflict between the nuclear powers during the Cold War. 25 years later, the Cold War is over, and the term is still being used, although its meaning may have shifted.
And typically, it's because no major powers have fought each other since. There's been no conflict between any of the world powers. Now, in a sense, there has been. If you look at, say, Korea or even Vietnam or even Afghanistan, that can be seen as proxy wars between the United States and the Soviet Union. And then even today, there's arguments to be made that proxy wars are still being fought between Russia and the United States. It depends on what you want to think of it. But I think there's not been open conflict between world leaders.
European countries have not fought each other, except for this 10-day war in 1956 when the Soviet Union invaded Hungary. When we look at European wars before World War II, it looks like this. They tend to be more frequent as you go back, though smaller in scale. And the largest 44 economies of the world have not battled each other since World War II.
As I said,
Rich countries have fought poorer countries, like the US versus Iraq.
poorer countries,
But
that's a
rich
way to
countries
put it.
have not fought other rich countries. Such a period of peace between the so-called great powers hasn't been seen since the Roman Empire. To many, peace is too strong of a word. Wars have occurred since World War II, and they can be grouped into these 4 categories. We don't see colonial wars anymore. We've already noted that interstate wars between rich countries have not occurred at all, and here we see wars involving smaller economies have tapered off. That leaves civil wars of 2 types, with and without foreign intervention. And this is what these battle deaths look like alongside of World War II. More people died fighting in World War II than in all the wars since. And again, we can't forget about world population, which has almost tripled since World War II. If we scale these numbers to show deaths in proportion to world population, showing the likelihood that a person on Earth dies in battle, the downward trend becomes even more pronounced. Now, this isn't to infer anything about why this trend is occurring. That's a discussion for another day. You can now interact with this chart to explore what conflicts are behind the totals. Now, bear in mind, we're just looking at battle deaths here, not civilian deaths, but those too are in decline. Peace is a difficult thing to measure.
True.
It's a bit like counting the people who didn't die in wars that never happened.
Yeah.
We give such importance to the word peace, but we don't tend to notice it when it occurs or
Yes.
report on it. Sometimes it takes reminding ourselves of how terrible war once was to see the peace that has been growing around us. Of course, this trend may not continue, and it's not clear how looking at these charts can help us make the right decisions to ensure that it does. But the longer the long peace grows, the more significant it becomes. So if watching the news doesn't make us feel hopeful about where things are heading, watching the numbers might.
There's a sequel. Ooh, I might have to check that out. I honestly have nothing else to say. This video is still absolutely beautiful. Wonderfully animated. Hits all that it needs to, demonstrates what it needs to, and puts everything in a great and excellent perspective. There. Yeah, I don't know what really needs to be said aside from that it's a great video. Probably just going to end it there. Yeah. I have no further comment. I think I made enough commentation throughout the 16 or so, 17-minute or so video. Yeah. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed, please hit that like button and more. Thanks.